All right, let's do this. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks to Hack in the Box for having me here. This is actually my first conference, and I think even my first international travel since the start of the pandemic, so really awesome to be here. And thank you for all you guys for listening to me waffle about kernel exploitation for the next hour. So without further ado, let's take a stab at demystifying remote Linux kernel exploitation, and I promise it's not as scary as it sounds. Great, the button's working, good start. So obligatory, who am I? First of all, my name's Sam. Some of you might know me online as Sam4K. I occasionally tweet things and enjoy blogging about Linux internals and kernel exploitation. Professionally speaking, I do vulnerability research and exploit development. Outside of work, I also enjoy doing vulnerability research and exploit development, so I'm not sure what that says about me, but I'm just a keen bean for Linux and security. I also have some normal hobbies as well, like gaming and cooking and things like that, so it's not all work. That's enough about me. Let's dive straight into the talk. Now, some of you might be thinking, like, Sam, that looks a lot like the 7 stages of grief, and you'd be absolutely right. When it came to trying to come up with a structure and format for this talk to kind of weave an interesting narrative, this was the first thing that came to mind. So make of that what you will, but I feel like it actually ended up fitting quite well. But I guess you guys can be the judge of that towards the end. So let's just start with the first stage, shock. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this all started with shock as I discovered a remote stack buffer overflow in the Linux kernel while I was looking for primitives to exploit another bug entirely. So for a bit of context here, I was currently new to my role and I was looking for a CVE to write up. So you're probably thinking it makes sense to play it safe, right? Maybe look for some low-hanging fruit, a nice simple primitive. Maybe it's in a module I'm familiar with, and maybe even there's an existing proof of concept out there to take inspiration from. This is where we queue this CVE here, discovered by Maxploit, which is a remote Linux kernel heap overflow. And spoiler alert, that is absolutely none of the criteria I just mentioned for playing it safe. There was no existing proof of concept out there for RCE. It was in some random networking module I'd never heard of before, and as we'll see, it was far from a simple primitive to exploit. But it's like RCE, right? This is like the holy grail for exploit developers, especially within the kernel. So like I had to give it a shot. But before the panic set in and I was like, what have I gotten myself into? That's where the game plan comes in. Because at the end of the day, these are inherently complex and open-ended problems. Like there's many different approaches you can take. There's many possible solutions, and sometimes there isn't even a solution at all. And if you take something like the Linux kernel, which is an incredibly vast and complicated code base, wherever you're looking, it can have its own nuances and idiosyncrasies. So by approaching these problems with kind of like a framework and some methodology, we're able to break down what can be a really daunting and overwhelming task into manageable bite-sized steps. And at least then, if we go through our framework and our methodology, if we get to the end of it and we haven't found anything, at least we can be content in knowing that we tried our best, we can take what we learn, and we can apply it to the next problem. Now, these kind of frameworks can vary from person to person. It's kind of about understanding your own strengths and weaknesses and tailoring this to your workflow. And it's an iterative process. The more you do this kind of thing, the more you can kind of streamline this. But for me, invariably, the first step when approaching these kind of problems is to really spend some time developing a strong foundation. So developing like a strong understanding of the exploitation primitive we're looking at, and also the attack surface. And I think it's easy to sometimes skip this and just jump straight into trying to pwn things. But by doing this and laying a solid foundation, it really pays dividends later on. Now, the next step is to put all this information, this understanding we've got, towards putting together our plan of attack. So we kind of want to know what our goal is, i.e. like popping a reverse shell or something, and then we want to piece together our understanding of both the surface and our primitive, of techniques and mitigations to put together a plan of attack for how we want to get there from our initial exploitation primitive. And then the next step is to begin enumerating our attack surface for these primitives to kind of put this plan of attack into action. But it's important to highlight, this is an iterative process. It might not often be the case that our initial plan of attack works. We might, find some primitives, but we might be missing another piece, or we might realize, actually, this just doesn't work. So there's an element of taking what we've learned, going back to the drawing board, and reapplying that information, coming up with a new plan of attack, and hopefully, after a few cycles of that, we come up with a win. So if we kind of zoom in on this process and take the heap overflow I just mentioned as a case study, let's start with that initial developing of understanding, right? So we have an unauthenticated remote heap overflow of attacker-controlled data within the Linux kernel in the networking stack. So we kind of want to ask ourselves straight away, like, what are the effective kernel versions? This can impact what mitigations are present, what techniques are available to us, and how we kind of go on moving forward. We then want to think about, can we trigger it? How reliably can we trigger this? And then kind of working together to put a proof of concept to make sure we can do this, and just gaining an understanding of the root cause of the primitive. And then next, we want to think about things like constraints. What are the constraints around triggering it? Where do we have to be on the network? Like, what's the constraints around the size for our attacker-controlled data? And then there's also more nuanced aspects around the exploitation primitive itself. So in the case of a heap overflow, we might be asking, like, how is this allocated? Is it in the slob allocator? Like, what caches are we targeting here? Is this a special purpose cache, a general purpose cache? What sizes are we looking at? So these are all things we want to factor in to develop an understanding of kind of what's going on here. And then, of course, the other aspect of this is understanding the attack surface we're looking at, because that exploitation primitive is just the first step. In contemporary kernels, we have a lot of work to do to be able to get where we want and to pop that shell. So again, while the remote surface is still a lot smaller than that exposed to a local attacker, it's still a lot of code to look through potentially. So again, this whole process is about making it manageable and kind of like feasible. So we'll start with narrowing the scope, and let's just look at the TIPC module, right? The bug's are already there, so that's a safe target. And we can always expand the scope later on if we need to. So for those of you not in the know about TIPC, it's the Transparent Inter-Process Communication Protocol, and this is basically a protocol for managing intra-cluster communications via this concept of different nodes in the cluster and the links between those nodes. And you can see this used in industry by telcos. So we kind of really want to spend some time just really understanding the ins and outs of the protocol, its kernel, its implementation within the kernel, and just trying to figure out what's going on. And we want to remember we're doing this within the context of being interested within the remote surface. So what parts of this implementation can we as remote attackers kind of touch and play around with? So this is things like, how do nodes authenticate with one another? What are the different TIPC message types? How do these look on the network? How is the packet handling for these different types implemented within the kernel? So how do we go about doing this? Well, this is where we cue like a montage of just trawling through documentation, auditing the source, getting some hands-on by writing up little libraries or scripts, and then even using tools like Wireshark to understand what this really looks like over the wire. So an important part of this process to highlight is just really bringing to the forefront the difference between interrupt context and the process context in terms of kernel exploitation. So typically when we're dealing with local privilege escalation, if we gain like control of kernel execution, this is typically happening within the process context. So this is where the kernel thread of execution is doing something on behalf of a user mode process, like carrying out a syscall or something. And notably, this kernel thread is associated with a user mode process. It has access to the task struct and kind of understands its privileges and things like that. However, as a remote attacker, we don't have a user mode process associated with us on the target. We're throwing a packet across the network to a target machine, or its network card will then receive this. It will trigger a hardware interrupt. An interrupt handler will then be called, and in our context, this could be like some TIPC packet handling code. And all this is happening in the network stack in the interrupt context. So notably here, there is no associated user space, and specifically, there's no context switching at all when we're operating in the interrupt context. So there's no sleeping, there's no scheduling, and there's no user mode access at all. So this presents some implications for remote attackers, because ultimately, if we want to pop a shell or something, we need to inject some kind of user mode payload. So this is all part of that developing understanding that we need to factor in when we move on to the next step and begin developing that plan of attack. So at this point, hopefully, we understand what we have with our arbitrary heap overflow. We understand where we are in the kernel and what we're dealing with. So we're in a position where we can come up with a plan of attack and begin kind of formulating how this exploit is going to look. So in this instance, we've got a heap overflow as a remote attacker. So the first thing we want to do is try and find some primitives which will allow us to remotely shape the heap. So we want to be able to fiddle with the heap and provide some flexibility to our heap overflow. So we're kind of looking for ways we can, like objects we might be able to spray allocations for, objects we can deterministically allocate and free. If we're really lucky, objects of varying sizes that we can kind of change which cache we're targeting. And hopefully the next step there is we want to really leverage this heap overflow alongside our heap primitives to leverage our memory corruption into a control flow hijacking primitive. So the way we'd want to do this is using our heap overflow to corrupt like a function pointer in an adjacent object, like a destructor or something, which will allow us to gain a control flow hijacking primitive. We can then use that to potentially pivot from the interrupt context, if that's where we're in execution, to the process context. And then now we're in a position to inject some kind of payload to pop a shell, right? Sounds good. Almost too good. Of course, we have a lot of mitigations to worry about. This is a great project by Alex Popov called the Linux Defense Map. I think this is for the 5.17 kernel. And you can see there is a lot going on. I couldn't fit it all on the screen. But basically, this is kind of like a flowchart of all the contemporary mainline, out-of-tree, commercial hardware mitigations, the relevant exploitation techniques, and then different detection mechanisms within the kernel. But everything in green here is a mainline mitigation currently implemented within the kernel. So as you can see, if we're looking to kind of pwn something, we've got a lot to factor in here. So this all can vary, based on the kernel versions we're looking at, the architecture, stuff like that. So we have to kind of take into account that understanding we've developed and apply that to figuring out what mitigations we've got to worry about. So in our instance, our initial plan of attack, we're looking at getting a control flow hijacking primitive. There's some kind of ROP chain there. So we have to worry about KSLR if we want to find our gadgets. Depending on how we want to pivot from the interrupt to the process context, we need to worry about things like write protection within the kernel. And then if we want to inject a user mode payload, we have to worry about mitigations like SMEP and SMAP. So a lot to factor in here, but we need to take all of this into account when we're developing that understanding and coming up with that plan of attack. So hopefully, with all this in mind, we're in a position to begin enumerating primitives. And I've kind of thrown this word around a lot, like what do I mean by primitives in this context? And these are basically just building blocks which help us progress our plan of attack. Little aspects of capability we're able to leverage within the kernel, given our exploitation primitives, which help us get from A to B. We start off with our initial heap overflow primitive. Maybe we can leverage that into a control flow hijacking primitive, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to piece these all together to get remote code execution. So how do we find them? Well, there's many approaches here, as with all the things in this field. For me, it really starts again with that fundamental understanding. By understanding the code we're looking at, we can narrow the scope easily. We're not looking at stuff that we're not going to be able to touch. And it also allows us to pick up nuances in the code itself. If we want to find inconsistencies in a bit of code, it really helps if we understand what's going on. The next step is about taking a targeted approach. Again, we want to break down this problem into manageable steps. For example, if we're looking for heap primitives, maybe we want to start with, let's look at all the kmalloc allocations or the slub allocations that are going on, kind of order them by size, what cache they're going into, if they're reachable, things like that. And then the next step of this is being methodical and making sure we document as much as we can, because this is all knowledge and understanding we're building up. And like I mentioned, this is an iterative process. So this attack plan might not work out, but some of the primitives or techniques we've come up with and we've discovered could be useful later on. So by documenting everything, we're saving ourselves some time. We're not going to repeat things, and it just makes life a lot easier. So when it comes to actually locating things and how do we look around, of course, there's good old-fashioned source auditing, just going through the flow and understanding what's happening. We can use things like regular expressions and the standard kernel guidelines to kind of narrow things down and look for particular signatures. And then we can go in with a bit of deeper analysis via kernel bugging if we really want to understand how a particular functionality works, how something looks in memory. And it was actually during this enumeration section where I actually came across the shock. At the time, we can see on the top left, I was looking for elastic objects within the TIPC module. So these are basically objects of dynamic length, so where their length is defined by a field within the object, as opposed to your typical static struct. And these are useful in contemporary exploitation techniques, because if we can corrupt that length, make it longer than it should be, and read it back, we can have an out-of-bounds read and potentially like a KSLR leak or something like that. So that was my motivation behind this. You can see to do so, I used a highly sophisticated regular expression here to try and find basically mem copies whose size parameter was the object's field rather than your typical size of struct. It wasn't foolproof, as the second result shows, but it did come up with one interesting one. So immediately I'm like, right, let's take a look at this, what's going on. So before we dive right into the code, a bit of context about this monitor subsystem, this part of TIPC. Part of this implementation is to handle the sending and receiving of domain records to different TIPC nodes within the same domain. And these domain records basically allow different TIPC nodes to tell their peers, hey, this is what my view of the network is, this is who I think is up, things like that. And we can see these domain records are implemented by this struct on the bottom left, struct TIPC mon domain. And we can see that is indeed an elastic object. We have this dynamically sized members field, the size of which is defined by member count. We can see there's a limit to this, defined by max mon domain, so we can have up to 64 members, but this can be of variable size. And then we have this len field, which determines the actual length in bytes of the object. So this will be the sum of all the static fields, and then the sum of this members field, depending on the size of member count. Okay, sounds good. So let's just take a look on the right. We can see that the mem copy is over here on line 30. So this is what we're interested in. Let's get a bit of context about what's going on in this piece of code. So the function on line 3, we can see it's TIPC mon receive. So this is the implementation which is responsible for receiving and processing these domain record packets. As we can see in the function signature up there, there's a lot of interesting parameters. Pertinent to us is this data and dlen. Data is a pointer to the TIPC packet's data that we've just received, and then dlen is the length of this data as defined in the TIPC packet header. So this is just being processed straight away. On line 6, we can see we immediately cast that new packet data to one of these domain records. And then on line 10 to 14, we kind of pull out the fields of this record into local variables. And then as we'd expect, on line 17 to 23, we do some sanitization to make sure this is a legitimate domain record. Namely, we're basically doing some checks against the packet length. So we check that the TIPC data length is at least long enough to hold an empty domain record. Otherwise, what's going on. The next check is to see that the TIPC packet length matches the size we'd expect for a domain record given the member count it's specified. And then finally, we check that the TIPC data length matches the length the domain record says it is in the len field. So if all this checks out, it all looks good, we go on to do some more processing. And then finally, on line 26 here, we'll do a block which basically says, okay, have we already received a domain record from this peer? If we have, we'll cache that old copy, which is where that mem copy comes in. And then later on, we'll update the peer to reflect the new domain record we've sent. Okay, bit of an information dump there, but that's what's going on. So where does our mem copy come in? So if we go back to that sanitization, we actually never check that member count is at least is equal to or less than this kind of limit we've defined here in max mon domain. So the reality is we could send a domain record with a member count of like 200, which would be much larger than the 272 bytes we're expecting here. And as long as the len field and the TIPC packet header's length all line up, we'll pass this sanitization. So then if we go on to reach this mem copy, so we cache one of these malicious domain records, which is much larger than it should be, we can see that, DOM is the previous domain record we've sent. We're using the length to determine the size of the mem copy. But then the destination object here is this DOM before. And if we look where that's defined, we can see this is actually a local struct. So this is being copied into a stack-based buffer, which is only expecting 272 bytes. So this is sounding an awful lot like a stack-based buffer overflow, right? Like pretty straightforward. Which brings us on to the next stage, denial, aka verification, lots and lots of verification on my part, and then disclosure. So I think I'd be remiss not to mention like the imposter syndrome is real in this industry, but I'm no exception to that. So like I checked this so many times to make sure what I was looking at was what I was actually looking at, because it's like, no way is this just sitting here, right? This isn't the case. So there's a lot of due diligence behind making sure this was legit, that I could trigger it reliably, remotely, coming up with a proof of concept, understanding like what was going on and the impact. And as soon as that was all clarified, that was the point to move on to carrying out the coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. And that had a few hurdles in itself on my part, and I wrote a blog about this if you're interested in the disclosure process. But the TLDR here is there's an initial embargo disclosure, so I will contact the relevant private mailing lists, which are in this case the Linux kernel distros and the Linux kernel security team. I'll send them analysis and a patch suggestion, and then suggest an embargo period. I think in this case it was 14 days, which is the maximum. And then there's some discussion, the patch is finalized, and then at the end of that embargo period, the patch is submitted, and at the same time, there's a public disclosure where I post that analyses on a public mailing list, which was the open source security one. And, all in all, it was a pretty quick turnaround. It was a really cool experience to interact with the community like that. I'd be lying if I said my disclosure debut didn't go off to a flying start. I had issues of like PGP and like Office 365 not liking each other, which meant like the first few emails I sent were just empty. Apart from this massive disclaimer, this confidentiality disclaimer, Office 365 was appending, which obviously wasn't a great look on a free and open source mailing list, but I digress. Got there in the end. It's all patched and fine now. But, that's the responsible stuff out the way. We've covered the soft skills. Let's try and get RCE on a modern kernel, which brings us on to the next stage, anger. So we've got a new bug. We're going to try approach this, exploit it. Let's not get overwhelmed. Let's recall the game plan. As we said, first step, get that understanding of what's going on, get the lay of the land, develop a plan of attack, figure out how to implement that by enumerating some primitives, and then win, right? Sounds good. So like before, we'll dive into this game plan in a little bit more detail, except this time we're using that newly found stack buffer overflow as our case study. Fortunately, all that time reading through documentation and writing hacky TIPC network libraries in C is all still relevant. So that's time well spent, at least, as the bug's in the same place. However, this time our exploitation primitive has changed. We've got different requirements to reach our goals of RCE now, that we're looking at Stack Overflow rather than a heap one. Namely, our route to control flow hijacking primitive could potentially be a lot easier here, right? If we just overflow that return address, we've got instant kernel control. And then we also, again, have to go through the process of understanding the primitive and our constraints. We're copying into a 272-byte buffer. It turned out that we couldn't just have len as large as we want. We're actually limited by the maximum transmission unit of the medium we're using. So we're looking at a typical Ethernet config and then take into account headers and stuff. We've got a 1400-byte payload going into that 272-byte stack. So we've got a bit of wiggle room there. And again, we know for sure now we're dealing with the interrupt context because we're directly going to be hijacking control during that TIPC packet handling code in the network stack. And then we've got some more information now, different kernel versions we have to consider based on what we want to target. Cool. So now we're in a position to come up with our plan of attack. It's looking pretty similar to before, except the start, again, we have a more simple route to a control flow hijacking primitive, potentially. So we want to go from that, like a ROP chain or something, to some more flexible form of arbitrary code execution. This will make it easier for us to pivot from that interrupt context to the process context. And then, like before, we're in a position to kind of like inject some kind of user space payload to get our final reverse shell or something, right? Again, sounding very easy. We have to consider the mitigations here. Great. Like before, if we're dealing with a control flow hijacking primitive, we want to do some ROP, we've got to worry about KSLR, so we can find the gadgets, write protection and stuff for our pivot, SMEP and SMAP for the user mode injection. But now, of course, we're looking at a stack-based buffer overflow, so our primitive's changed a little bit. How does that impact the mitigations we've got to worry about? Well, now we have to worry about stack protector, which introduces stack canaries, so that's another leak requirement we need. And then we also have a relatively new mitigation, which was implemented last summer, I think in 5.12 kernels, called Fortify Source. And part of this mitigation introduced strict memcopy bounds checking. So basically, if the kernel at compile time or boot time, or runtime, knows the size of either the source or destination objects of a memcopy. If the size is larger than those, then something's wrong. We'll just trigger a kernel panic, and we're done. Now, this sounds a lot like the root cause of the stack-based buffer overflow we've been looking at, and it exactly is. So that is just a hard mitigation to to what we've been looking at, talking about, and the plan of attack we've come up with. So that's it, I guess. Or we could just target a kernel prior to this fortify source coming in, right? We could just do one like maybe prior to 512. We've got good coverage, so let's go with that, right? And then we've got to still find this KSLR and canaries leak. But what if we just say, given a nice leak, given, we can plug in a leak down the line, maybe we'll find one, maybe someone else will find one. What if, given a leak, what does our attack really look like, right? It would be a shame to have wasted all this time. Let's just steam on ahead for a little bit and try implement this plan of attack and see what it looks like in action. So after a few, iterative processes of enumerating this attack plan, now that we're going ahead with it, it looks something like this. So we want to pivot from our initial RIP control, so our initial control flow hijacking primitive using ROP. We need to get some shellcode execution. We've got a lot of data on the stack. Let's try and find a way to use it. And then to pivot to the process context, we're going to use a technique called syscall hooking. And then we can use that hook to deliver our user mode payload and win, right? All sounds good. So now we're actually getting to some technicals. We got the attack plan out of the way. Let's just get our bearings a little bit before we dive into some code so we can understand where we are, right? So we've got this stack-based buffer overflow. Let's get a bit of context. There's a few things we can do here to kind of build up our understanding of what's going on. On the bottom right, we can kind of look at the disassembly for the vulnerable function. We can look at like the prologue and the epilogue, so we can kind of understand what's being done to the stack. We can see the size of the stack frame. We can see the registers that are being popped off. We have control over. And then on the left, this is an output from GDB. We can break on the vulnerable memcopy to kind of see what the stack looked like before our overflow. So this is a picture of the TIPC mon-receive stack frame. We can see where our buffer is going to be overflowing. We can see the original values of some of those saved registers. And then we can continue looking down this to see the stack frames that are after this and what other damage we're going to cause. And with all this information in mind, we're in a position to kind of get an idea, like on the top right, of what our payload might look like in memory, the kind of offsets to our different fields and constraints, where we want certain values to go. So now we've got an understanding of like where we are, what's going on. It's time to actually get to work and figure out how we want to go from our initial ROP chain to getting a more flexible form of execution, right? We've got all this space on the stack to put data in. It'd be really cool if we could just jump to that and execute that, right? Fortunately, with a control flow hijacking primitive like ROP, we've got the keys to the kingdom essentially here, right? We've got all the tools and functionality provided to us by the kernel, so we've got a lot of options. One of which is a function called setMemoryX, which does what it says in the tin. It allows us to set a specified number of pages in memory as executable. So if we just point this to our stack, we can set our kernel stack as executable, and just like that, we're back in the 90s. We can jump to RSP, and we'll be able to execute our shellcode. So not too much work there. We have the usual issues of ROP in terms of fiddling with trying to get stuff in registers. We've got to kind of make sure the arguments are page aligned, stuff like that, but all pretty feasible. However, like Spider-Man's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility. We've got this awesome keys to the kingdom, this control in the kernel, but, if we do anything wrong, if we stray off the path just a little bit, we're probably going to cause a kernel panic or some undefined behavior, and that's the end of our attack plan right there. So it's really important that we spend some time making sure that once we, done what we need to do, when we hand control back to the kernel, that we do so, really well, and that we spend some time making sure our cleanup is well done. So when it comes to kind of cleaning up these stack-based buffer overflows and handing execution back, there's a few things we need to do. First of all, we need to find somewhere along those list of stack frames that we haven't completely screwed up, and then think, right, we're going to hand execution back here. We want to ask ourselves, like, what is RSP, what is RBP, what do the stack pointers need to look like? We want to think, does it expect any register values? Because we might have skipped a lot of code here as we chuck execution back to the kernel. So we want to think, is it expecting, any registers to hold certain values? And then we also need to have a think about, what has happened in those functions, in those bits of code that we've just skipped over. Have any locks been taken? In which case we might end up with a deadlock or something like that. And again, undefined behavior or kernel panic, not great, attack plan is over. So we have to spend some time looking through the code and understanding what's going on there. And of course, in this case, there were locks taken, so more work for me. Unfortunately, there's a lock taken or 2 locks taken in the object which represents our TIPC node. Okay. Again, we've got the keys to the kingdom, so we can just use functions provided by TIPC to find this node and then release those locks. The issue here is that TIPC is a loadable module, so this is loaded after boot time, which means it's kind of at a dynamic address. So our already very generous and hypothetical KSLR leak doesn't help us with this. We need to kind of work out where TIPC has been loaded into memory. Again, fortunately, because we have this information on the stack, return addresses and things within the TIPC networking stack, if we find a valid TIPC symbol, we can use that to calculate the base address of the TIPC module, and then we can actually call some of those functions to find our node and release that log. So we can see here in this snippet of cleanup assembly, we've pulled one of these symbols off the stack, which we know the value of and what it's pointing to, calculate the base address of the TIPC module, and then we're in a position to call TIPC node find, then we can release our locks, and then we're back to basics of just correcting RSP and RBP, setting up some values and jumping back to execution. However, all of this takes up a lot of space, and now we have to worry about making sure we don't corrupt the last TIPC symbol on the stack. So we're in a position here where we have to reevaluate. We've now got a lot smaller space on the stack, and we have to factor that in moving forward. We've already taken up a lot of space with this cleanup, which we have to do every time. So that's another piece of the puzzle we need to factor in. But on the plus side, we now have, arbitrary shellcode execution on the stack. We can throw some more payloads now that the stack is executable. We don't have to take up so much space doing ROP. What's the plan now? So like I mentioned, we're still in the process context here. So we kind of have to think about, right, we need to get we're in the interrupt context now. So we need to get to the process context so there's actually user space we can inject our final payload into. Now, the way we're going to do that, as I mentioned earlier, is a technique called syscall hooking. This is commonly used in things like rootkits, but it's actually great for us because what better way to hijack the process context than the fundamental API between user space and the kernel. So a quick TLDR on how syscalls work in Linux, using x86-64 as an example. The user space program wants the kernel to do something. Cool. So basically, it will put the registers, put the arguments for that syscall in the right registers. It will put the number of the syscall it wants to call in RAX, and then it will execute the syscall instruction, which will trigger a software interrupt. The user space context is saved. We transition over to the kernel, and we basically end up somewhere where this diagram is here in a function called doSyscall64. This will then use that syscall number as an index into a structure called syscall table, which is just a table of function pointers to the relevant implementation for those syscalls. So our plan here is to basically overwrite one of those syscall table entries to point to our own shellcode, do some stuff, and then hand execution back to the correct handler as if nothing had happened. Sounds pretty good. So we know the what. How do we do that? Again, fairly straightforward. Now that we've got, shellcode execution, we've got a lot of tools available to us thanks to the kernel. So some of the first steps we want to do is obviously make sure we save the original value of what we're trying to corrupt. So our payload, our hook can actually hand execution back to there. We then need to, if we see on line 11, we need to actually allocate some space for our hook to live in. So we can use, again, tools provided by the kernel like kzalloc. But again, remembering to do things atomically because we're still in the interrupt context, so we can't sleep, there's no scheduling or anything like that. So we allocate some space. We then need to, again, set this space as executable because the kernel's not expecting these heap allocations to be running code. And then we're in a position, once we've set up this space, this region for our hook, we've made it executable, we're in a position to actually begin overriding the syscall table. And again, the kernel is not expecting tweaks to this, so there's some write protections we need to take care of, but there's functions like set memory read write, which allow us to sort that out. And then we can also, disable write protection if necessary. And then just like that, we can overwrite that entry with a pointer to our freshly allocated hook shellcode. And just like that, we now have a hook for arbitrary code execution in the process context. Pretty awesome. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some size constraints. So our initial hook is actually very small because, as you can see in that previous slide, that takes up a lot of space, and then we also have to worry about the cleanup as well. So our first hook, it actually doesn't do anything. It just calls the original handler, but now we have that executable allocated region. We can send another payload to copy our fully fleshed out hook into that. So what do we want to do here? We're almost there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Again, we've got tools provided to us by the kernel. So the first thing we want to do is just check, is this process that's called this syscall, is it root? If it's not, we don't want like an unprivileged shell, right? So we ignore it. We can just carry on hand execution back to the syscall handler like nothing happened. However, if it is root, okay, we're interested. So one useful thing about these syscall handlers is they're passed a pointer to a structure called ptreg, which is basically a structure which contains that saved user space state. So it contains all the register values for the user space process, which will then be restored when execution's handed back to the user space. So we save that state because we're going to tamper with it in a little bit. So we save that state in our user space payload. We can then map some memory into user space because we're in the kernel. Why not? So we can make some read-write executable mapping into user space. We can then copy our own user space payload into that region, and then using that ptreg, we can update user space's instruction pointer such that when we clean up and hand execution back to the syscall handler, when those register values are restored, it continues execution in our payload that we've just injected. Okay, we're almost there. Now we have some code execution in a privileged process. We're in a position to finally get our RCE. Still have to clean up though. We don't actually have any control over what process we've landed up in. We just know that it's called the syscall we've hooked. So, the first thing is we can just fork. If we're in the parent, we can use that register state we saved to repair any values that we changed and return execution to where it's supposed to be, and do any relevant cleanup. However, in the child, we can then, we're free, we're in a privileged process, we can call like a callback payload or something to return to the attacker. So just like that, we got our RCE. But let's go back to reality for a second and actually talk about some mitigations, which brings us on to the next stage, depression. As we saw, that Linux kernel defense map is like vast and varied. There's a lot going on, right? And we have to kind of take that all in during this exploit development process. And there's lots of factors which can determine what mitigations we're dealing with, whether that's kernel version, the architecture, the kernel config, as well as the bug type and the techniques we're looking to exploit. And it's really important during this exploit development process to continue to factor that in and be aware of the relevant mitigations. If we take into account our game plan, right from the offset as part of that developing our understanding, we want to be able to kind of draw the dots, right? So we're looking at, this kernel version, okay, that means these mitigations are present, and then just kind of asking ourselves, is this mitigation like a soft mitigation, which is going to introduce additional requirements for our attack plan, or is this a hard mitigation, which is going to kill our attack plan entirely? And then we also need to kind of apply this understanding to our specific context, right? Each area of the kernel, each bug type, can all have its own nuances, and how does the efficacy of this mitigation particularly affect our circumstances? How does the efficacy vary between like local privilege escalation and RCE, for example? So if we take this extremely simplified and very naive diagram of the constituent components of a generic exploit, based on the stuff we've covered today, we can see we start off with a kernel vulnerability, like our stack-based buffer overflow. We're looking to leverage that into kernel control, like our ROP or our shellcode execution. And then the final goal is our actual elevation of privileges, via a shell or a reverse shell or something like that. So if we touch on some of the mitigations we mentioned today, it's going to be pretty brief, but SMEP and SMAP, for example, supervisor mode execution prevention seeks to stop attackers, pivoting from kernel execution and jumping straight back to a user space payload. And supervisor mode access prevention seeks to stop attackers of kernel execution from accessing any kind of user space data. And this notably sits right between that kernel control and that privilege escalation. So after the attackers potentially have those keys to the kingdom, and again potentially have a vast array of tools provided to them by the kernel to kind of work around that. And we can see that in contemporary exploitation techniques today, SMEP and SMAP, there's plenty of alternatives for attackers to use to kind of bypass this due to the wider range of options available to them at this point. Whether that's using other kernel functions like commit creds for local attackers to elevate their processor's privileges, or data corruption techniques like overriding modprobe path. Again, all of these options are available to them and allow them, again, depending on the primitives available to the attacker, to kind of find alternate routes to that privilege escalation. Conversely, if you look at mitigations like KSLR and Stack Protector, these sit prior to the attacker having those keys to the kingdom, having those elevated privileges, and as a result, they have less tools at their disposal to be able to bypass these or work around them. That said, I don't think it's a particularly hot take to say that KSLR isn't the biggest hurdle for local attackers to deal with, and we can see this historically. If we look at exploits in the wild, KSLR isn't the biggest mitigation out there. And then we have Stack Protector as well, which again introduces a higher degree of requirement for a leak. But I think notably here, unlike SMEP and SMAP, which is kind of the same locally or remotely, once you have that kernel control, you have a lot of options available to you. However, while KSLR may be a bit of a meme locally, if you kind of switch the context from the outside as a remote attacker, I think the compounding impact of both not having kernel control yet and the drastically reduced size of the remote attack surface means that, yes, suddenly a mitigation which may not be a side for local attackers is actually a really potent mitigation for remote attackers, which I think is sometimes easy to forget. And then of course we have things like fortify source, which is an example of just a hard mitigation which cuts the attack plan, the exploit off right at that initial kernel vulnerability by mitigating it at the root cause. And I think this is the same locally or remotely. If it's patched, it's patched. And there's plenty more out there which I haven't touched on, plenty more commercial, out of tree, some things that aren't enabled by default in configurations, and on the horizons as well. There's plenty more out there which would introduce a lot more issues in some of the techniques I've talked about today. That's enough depression. Let's move on to the next stage, testing, aka how I do mine, my workflow, and why I think Emacs is the best IDE. Besides really having to get my mileage out of this 7 stages of grief analogy, I actually find it really interesting to hear about people's different processes and workflows. I think particularly in this space as well, it's like less glamorous than all the cool like shells popped and stuff like that. But it is the stuff that facilitates all the fun stuff. So, it's interesting to hear. And I figured I'd just talk briefly about mine. So the first cornerstone of the workflow, obviously the IDE, a lot of time is going to be spent in that. I do use Emacs, yeah, I'm that guy. But now for real, I've got to give a shout out to a talk by Russell Curry called Kernel Hacking Like It's 2020, which introduced me to a pre-config setup for Emacs called Doom. So not super nerdy, it's not much tweaking involved there. But for me, this is really great for my kind of workflow because it allows me to, navigate large and complex code bases like the Linux kernel with minimal overhead. It's very quick and snappy jumping between references and definitions, unlike some Electron-based IDEs I've used in the past. And also it's really great to have everything in one environment. So packages, having quality of life stuff, having riprep under the hood, or Magit for the Git workflow. And then even org mode, as I've mentioned, the emphasis of organizing things is really great as well. But moving on, the other cornerstone, of course, is virtualization. Another really fundamental part of this kind of work is being able to quickly spin up test environments and stuff. For me, I go for QEMU. I think this is a really lightweight and flexible option here. And what's really great about this, and this is the same on VirtualBox and VMware, is the GDB stub. which makes kernel debugging like a lot easier. So it allows you to connect to your guests via GDB for kernel debugging, either via your host or another guest. So that kind of power couple of QEMU and GDB really gets me through a lot of this as well. I put in brackets there Jeff, the GDB enhanced features, which is a nice quality of life plugin for GDB, particularly based around the workflow for exploit developers and reverse engineers. So that also adds some quality of life features on top of a very old debugger, which makes life easier there. But abstracting away a little bit from the tools, I guess as I've highlighted during this talk, I really try to have a structured approach to my documentation and try to document as much as possible. Whether that's markdown notes or org mode or whatever works for you, like by documenting everything and making it easy to refer back to, it just, helps if you have to go over a project, after a number of months or years, like I had to when I wrote this talk, or if you want to share it or things like that. Like you'll kick yourself if you forget to do this. And then I think inherently, as part of like exploit development and vulnerability research, we really find ourselves like writing hacky scripts and tools and things to kind of like do workarounds or just make our lives easier. And, I really advocate for trying to generalize these solutions where possible, because more often than not, you might end up needing them down the line. So if you can spend a little bit of extra time to make this generalized and reusable, like absolutely try and do it. And then also don't be afraid to share these hacky scripts and setups. Even however niche or messy you think it is, like there's probably someone out there who will need it at some point. Like the amount of times I've been working on a really niche project and I found like some one-star GitHub which has just had just a bit of information I need has happened more than you might think. But yeah, I guess that leads us on to the final stage, acceptance, aka me doing this talk. Hopefully, during this talk, I've kind of provided some insights into the processes behind both like discovering a vulnerability and then trying to exploit it, highlighting that, kernel exploitation is cool, but also that it's not so scary once you break it down. Like it's not some obscure, esoteric mastery, but actually it just draws from lots of skills, not least of which are perseverance and determination, but also, like Chris mentioned in the keynote earlier, lots and lots of curiosity. Just spending some time really understanding how things work to put you in a position to be able to break them. I think another important thing as well is also that like success and winning isn't binary in this kind of work. You're not always going to be able to pop that shell or find that bug. But like that's normal. That's part of the job. As we've mentioned and as we highlighted through this process, during that journey, during that framework, you're going to be deepening your understanding, you're going to be improving your workflow, developing tools, discovering techniques and primitives, all things which you can add to your tool belt and apply to projects down the line and secure future wins. And also the importance of sharing, I think. Like, I didn't study kernel exploitation at uni or anything like that. Like, my knowledge is the culmination of both practical application, but also consuming the wealth of like write-ups and publications that are out there and that have been shared by the community. And it's this kind of thing that really drives the industry forward. Because obviously malicious attackers are out there doing the same thing, but, they're just not writing write-ups about it. And then, hopefully it's just been cool to cover this all from a remote perspective. Like there's a wealth of write-ups out there on local privilege escalation. So hopefully by, covering some familiar stuff and also some different stuff has provided an interesting take on all this. I've also got some resources here, like a bunch of the stuff I've mentioned are all up here. If any of you guys see me around the conference, feel free to come at me and talk to me about Linux kernel, like internals or exploitation techniques, anything like that. Like I love this stuff and I'm always happy to talk about it. Likewise, if you'd rather like message me online, also totally happy with that. But yeah, I think that's everything. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sam. I think we got a couple of questions from the audience. What tool do you recommend to use to document enumerating primitives?
In terms of documentation, like I'm pretty basic. Maybe I'm just a masochist, but like I just use Markdown. Like everything I do is in Markdown for documentation. I try and keep it as compartmentalized, so I have different, not just one massive file, like I have different files for different areas, different parts of my plan and my process. So yeah, just Markdown or whatever works for you really. At the end of the day, you're the one that's going to be using this and reading this, so like whatever works with your workflow. Yeah, so hopefully that's not too disappointing, but Markdown, I guess, is the answer there.
All right, thanks. The next one is, when doing cleanup of the stack, could we just execute a failure condition instead? After we return back to our current function call, we set the registry value such that it fails the length checks in the function. Instead of cleaning the stack ourselves, the kernel will handle it as the function failing.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of that process and that cleanup is finding the easiest way to clean up the stack. I think in this instance, due to the size of the payload, we've gone way past our initial vulnerable function. So if we try to return to the vulnerable function, it would run through that fine. We failed the checks. But then it goes to restore the previous stack frame, and we've also corrupted that as well. So there's issues there. So basically the process of this is finding the nearest spot that doesn't have a corrupted, stack frame that it can recover from well. But that is the general approach, is we want to find the nearest spot, even if it's a fail condition, to basically restore execution to. But yeah, in this case, that wasn't possible because we'd clobbered all the 2 or 3 stack frames after that.
All right, thanks. And the final question, any recommendations on places to get started with kernel exploitation? Practical labs or CTF challenges?
Absolutely. I think practical application is 100% the way to go with these things. It can be really daunting at first because, like I mentioned, the kernel exploitation and stuff is so big and there's so much going on, and you're never going to understand it all, right? I'm nowhere near understanding most of the stuff in the kernel, but it's just that process of, again, finding a bite-sized challenge and just chipping away at that. And the more you do these kind of CTFs and these challenges, the more knowledge you're kind of adding to your tool belt. Some you'll forget, but some you'll retain. And it's all about kind of reapplying that all down the line. So I think, yeah, CTFs are great. I mean, there's loads around. Also write-ups as well. Again, I don't know the best way to find these things. I just use Twitter just to see all my stuff, and I think a lot of people do that as well. So there's a bit of curation involved there in terms of following the right people and stuff. But I think, yeah, both getting some hands-on with exploitation via CTFs and stuff, getting some hands-on with just understanding kernel stuff like kernel internals, and then also just reading some write-ups and learning that way. So it's just, again, picking what works for you, what's best based on your strengths and weaknesses, but just diving in, I think, is the best way. And then that curiosity of, if you're ever trying to bash your head against something, don't just keep going at it. Just take a pause. What don't I understand? Go off and understand it, come back and go that way. It can be frustrating if you just try and do one of these CTFs and you just want to get the flag or get the shell. It's going to be difficult. So just take your time, enjoy it, and enjoy the process, I'd say.
Awesome. Thanks. If there's no more questions, let's give Sam another round of applause. So we're going to take a break for lunch. Lunch is served outside. We'll reconvene at 2 p.m. in the same room. There's also lots of exhibitions and CTF challenges out there. There's a drone hacking village at the corner. You've got crypto hacking challenges. You've got lock picking villages and so on. Thank you.